So let's now take a look more into neurobiology. We kind of talked a little bit more of kind of the neuroimmune endocrinology that goes on and how stress and all these homeostatic stressors can affect dysregulation in multiple body systems. Excuse me, but let's start looking into the spinal cord, the periphery, and into the brain, and kind of talk a little bit about how those areas can kind of participate in a pain experience. And the problem is we've learned about a peripheral nervous system and a central nervous system. The body doesn't care. It's all one it's all one system. So I think too often we cordon off the periphery and central, and the body doesn't care that it's periphery and century. It's all one intermingled, fed information from the periphery into the central that modulates output into the periphery. So we got to try to work our way away from this kind of cordoning off peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. But anyway, let's talk about pain from the peripheral perspective first. So we've talked already a bit about how the sampling function of our nervous system, where we're going to get extra receptive information, but also interoceptive information from our tissues, musculoskeletally, viscerally, and everything to determine what needs to happen with that. Now, one thing that I didn't really understand as I was getting into this information, and I'm going to share things that I thought were pearls for me that made me understand, okay, that makes sense, was a thing called the axonal reflex. So basically what the axonal reflex is to think about pain, because I thought about it very linearly as far as the messages coming in, where just one straight line into the dorsal horn and all was good. But when we get noxious input into a receptor on a sensory nerve, a nociceptor, we get this axonal reflex where it doesn't just travel down the axon, it'll go into the dendritic tree or receptive field around that area and stimulate, a axonal reflex, where at the top you can see how it talks about stimulating keratinocyte peripheralization, always struggle with that word, and tissue repair. So again, we need that to start stimulating the tissue healing process. There also is the arterial stimulation, so it helps modulate the permeability of our vasculature to allow the nice chemicals in our bloodstream to start permeating that area from the immune system and other areas to start. So that's again one of these neuroimmune connectors where we can start influencing our vascular permeability to allow our immune system more access to that body part. A direct neuroimmune modulator is where that axonal reflex will cause release of chemicals that cause mast cells to degenerate. Mast cells are an immune system chemical that when they are lysed or let loose, they let a lot of immune competent molecules out there that are going to help stimulate an immune reaction in the tissues. And then there's smooth muscle function that can regulate sweating and different functions around there. But it's just to understand that when you got a stimulus noxiously into a receptor, that there's going to be some influence into the tissues and the receptive field around it from a more than just danger message perspective. But this also, there's always going to be inputs. When I touch, I'm getting some of that input into my tissues, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily throwing a bunch of dangerous stuff out there, but it might start modulating some of that permeability. So it's kind of on a continuum where that information coming in just normally from our tissues in a non-dangerous way still can kind of modulate how permeable our vasculature is, how active is our tissue repair mechanism. Ideally, when we don't have noxious information, it's not stimulating significantly. It's maybe just stimulating enough of that skin activity to maintain a good, healthy dermal areas of our body. But anyway, I'm not going to go into the weeds of that. The other thing that's important around our peripheral nerves is to understand that they are, and nervous system in general, is that we get a kind of a genetic set when we're born of how sensitive and how our nervous system is kind of wired. And a lot of it's passed on. If you read Sapolsky's stress literature about prenatal and postnatal stress and how it influences kiddos and how they kind of can have failure to thrive and other things that go on because of some of these stressors. So we pass on a lot of our nervous system's sensitivity. Now, again, that's kind of the nature of it. Now, nurture and our life experience can modulate that and cause different things to be expressed. But it's the one thing to know is that our receptors are created based on our DNA that gets transferred into mRNA that becomes proteins that create this lovely little ion channel that can be receptive to stress and different things that ion channels can all be receptive to. Heat changes, mechanical stimulus, a lot of different things, immune molecules, whatever it may be. And then that ion channel will then thus get plugged into the axon to get to help that nerve become sensitive to whatever your genetics and your experience decided to express based on what that organism that you are decided is most important to express for survival in your environment. So there's a field called epigenetics, which is basically to show that how our genetic set can be expressed, where different genes are switched on and off depending on life experience and other factors, more than just a baseline written in stone genetic set. We have a baseline genetics, which is kind of like the playbook, but we can run different plays in that playbook depending on our environment. Our different genes can get switched on and off depending on environmental cues and life experiences, and internal cues and interoceptive disease processes and things that can switch these things on and off as well. But it's just to know that our genetic set is not written in stone, and what can be wired into a very sensitive state through this process. The good thing we know also is these ion channels only hang out 24 to 48 hours. They're constantly kind of turned over to new ion channels. So it's just to give us hope that there's plasticity in this, that if we can stimulate more safety deciding behaviors and more homeostatic down-regulating actions in our body, that maybe we can start wiring ourselves to be less sensitive through this mechanism. The other thing that was always confusing to me is I was always taught that if it was an afferent nerve or a sensory nerve, it was afferent and messages only traveled inward towards the nervous system. There was nothing going on from those nerves out into the tissues, which isn't true. What we now know, and this isn't really terribly new knowledge, but is that these sensory nerves will definitely give orthodromic information as far as information into the central nervous system. But that information comes around this bend here, and you can see that central modulation box where it's going to be modulated, again, based on danger or am I safe around that tissue information, and cause a CNS influence on that sensory nerve antidromically as far as messages coming into the tissue, because all of those sensory nerves have an antidromic trophic function where they're secreting chemicals into the tissues. I always say it's like if you have a swimming pool, you have a pool guy who's always balancing the chemicals in your pool so it's safe to swim in. Well, it's kind of like your central nervous system is constantly having a secretion through those peripheral terminals into the tissues of chemicals that get stimulated or released into your tissues to modulate that chemical balance in your tissues. Now that can go way awry in injury, where your tissues truck in a bunch of pro-inflammatory danger type chemicals that raise the immune system into those tissues, where you get primary and secondary hyperalgesic responses, which again are very helpful. We need those. But in the presence of like a nerve injury and CRPS or other things that cause significant backfiring or antidromic communication in tissues, you can get these nerves where they communicate and go buck wild into these tissues and create significant sensitivity, significant swelling, redness. Those CRPS patients where their tissues are look like their whole arm is one big swollen arm, that's likely a combination of disinhibition and neurogenic inflammation that's just trucking that kind of chronic swelling and inflammatory stuff into tissues that make them barely be able to be touched, if touched at all. So again, we can start making sense of this when we start seeing that trophic function of nerves with that trophic act on tissue chemical release function that those nerves have. So that gives us an idea, and again, I don't think we need to demonize that process with patients. That's a very helpful process. We should be having swelling. Swelling is something, especially in the acute stage, don't make it be something bad with a patient. Don't, oh my God, look at your swelling, let me measure it and make you freak out about it. Butler talks about, look at you, you natural self-healer, you, good for you, that's awesome. I do this with all my post-surgical knees or folks post-injury. Like, this swelling is amazing. Now, of course, we don't want to let it get exaggerated and severe, but that's your immune system. That's healing, baby. That's everything we want to go on in your body. So let's not fight it. If it gets excessive and starts disrupting things, sure, we'll ice it, but we shouldn't clamp off the healing response in our body. I think it's something that some folks get so maladaptive and they're sitting on ice 24 hours a day that maybe we should let that thing swell and let your immune system and your healing apparatus do its thing. So that's just my little sidebar with that. Let's now move to the spinal cord. So we went into periphery, now we're moving into the spinal cord and getting into some of that gate control things that we talked about. Now, one way that I like to think of it, and this I think Adrian Lowe's group first introduced me to it, is to think of this interneuron or dorsal horn modulator of connectivity from these nociceptive specific and A beta fiber connectivity to the nociceptive pathways into the brain, the bouncer kind of can modulate that connectivity, which again being that inner neuron a little bit. But when you have a danger message coming in from the nociceptive apparatus, ideally it has, if it's of significant intensity, it has access into that nociceptive specific fiber. That's that gate control graphic that we showed earlier, where it has the ability to gain access to that nociceptive danger pathway to the brain. And then the bouncer is kind of keeping the connectivity of other things around the dorsal horn, because we have to understand that the A beta fibers have connectivity into this dorsal horn, and we're not going to go into the laminae of the dorsal horn, but different layers of the dorsal horn have different cell bodies that are representative of where these A beta fibers have connection, where sympathetics have connection. Our other levels of our body have connectivity into that dorsal horn. The other side has connectivity into the dorsal horn of that opposite side. And then we also have the gain or dimmer effects of central modulation. Does it need to turn the gain of that stimulus and bring more of that stimulus up because it's highly dangerous or conceived to be dangerous? Or is it, hey, there's other more important things in my environment, you are not dangerous or important to me, and the dimmer switch or the central inhibition comes down from the brain. So that's kind of how, when things are going, where things aren't sensitized, that's where things can go. Sometimes when the nervous system decides, hey, there's other things that are important, this episodes where you get a bruise and you don't remember what the heck happened, or you have bleeding and you don't know where the injury came from. Likely in that situation, that your nervous system disinhibited it by it said, pain off, this top-down modulation of pain, this isn't important to me. I mean, we can show other stories of where people should have severe amounts of pain yet don't, because there's other things going on in the environment. That's why if somebody sprains their ankle and a train's running at them, that the ankle can not hurt for them to scramble and run away from a train. So this is a very helpful top-down survival type mechanism of if there's bigger threats in your environment, that central nervous system can top-down shut down that danger message from coming in to the dorsal horn. But also, if you get this significant bombardment from top down, where there's danger, gain coming from top down, or significant bombardment in from the periphery, where it's just bombarding noxious input, this bouncer can get overwhelmed. And what I always joke with students it's like the Black Friday situation at Walmart, where we got the poor workers at Walmart who get trampled from these people who are looking for Black Friday deals, and all of a sudden this bouncer gets overwhelmed, and now everybody's getting into the party. So your A beta fibers start getting access into these nociceptive specific danger pathways. And what do we think with that? That's probably the patient now that even light movement or touch, things that travel on A beta fibers, now can generate a pain experience. So allodynia, hyperalgesia, things like that, where these A beta fibers should be reporting movement or touch, are now reporting that sensation, but danger, and you're getting significant pain experiences because of it. Sympathetics can start wiring into the experience, where you start noticing autonomic changes that correlate with your pain. Other levels, so again, like we spoke about in past lectures, where this nice L3 dermatome of a neuropathic pain issue, or from a disc herniation in the back, or whatever it may be, now is spreading to where it's smudging all into the L4 and L2 dermatome, where it's not making that nice neat dermatomal pain pattern that we love to treat. Or other sides can start getting involved. So these are the patients that come and see us. You know what? This elbow pain I have on the left side, I'm starting to feel the same pain on my other side. Now, oftentimes people don't win the pain lottery, or maybe there is a mechanical reason for it, but also there's probably some neurologic reasons where there doesn't have a mechanical history or reason why that would happen, where they weren't using it differently or doing anything. Maybe we can start explaining these mirror pains based on this neurobiology that we know goes on, where all of a sudden the other side's getting connectivity into a danger nociceptive specific pathways up into the central nervous system. So as we consider this, we got to understand dendritic trees, as far as these receptive fields in dendritic trees can spread into different areas where it's where this little receptor should just be a little needle point of discomfort. Again, that immune system and endocrine system and trophic function of your nervous system can cause that axonal reflex to cause a nice circle of pain around where the injury was, not just right at where the tissue is. And then sleeping versus awake synapses. So we have synapses that are not often awake in a pain experience, but when there's significant input into that system and biochemically things change in that dorsal horn environment, it awakens synapses that raise the sensitivity level and responsiveness of our nervous system. We also need to know that there's tonic inhibitory control from higher centers where that dimmer switch is constantly dimming out information. When you put socks on your feet, for instance, you have the conscious sense of socks being on your feet just for a brief time period, and then tonic inhibitory control inhibits that sensation out of your environment, because you don't need to know you have socks on your feet. It's not a dangerous sensation. You don't need to know about it, so that should happen. The problem with people, especially with chronic pain, is they are so conscious of their body part that tonic inhibitory issue starts leaving the patient, and they really struggle with that with hypervigilance and other factors. Receptive fields are just to know that often the spreading pain, where that one little receptive field that goes into the dorsal horn, now because of disinhibition and that connectivity of others, sleeping synapses awakening, and the ability of those other neighboring receptive fields to have access into that pain experience, all of a sudden this pain starts spreading where the nice lateral ankle around the anterior talofibril ligament in your lateral ankle sprain, man, that whole lateral foot and up into the mid lower leg is sensitive. So we're getting other receptive fields that are becoming involved into that pain experience. Now let's look at pain from the brain's perspective. So let's look at the central nervous system and see how the brain influences things with pain. We've talked a bit about how the brain samples itself. So it's looking at the past memories. So in your hippocampus, it calls upon a lot of the wired-in memories that the nervous system may have. We're going to look at knowledge. What do I know about this? What do I think about this? What have I learned from past experience? I'm going to look at beliefs. What are my beliefs around a back when it hurts? Do I need to immobilize it? Is it safe for me to move? Whatever that may be. Cultural learning. Cultures have different beliefs on how we should behave and think around pain. Past successful behaviors. What have you done in the past that might be helpful to do again in the future? Oh gosh, when I had this problem in the past, I went to the physio and they really got me moving again, and this went well. So again, they're going to hopefully seek that and have that behavior going forward when they have pain in the future. And then past successful behaviors created or observed in others. That's where we don't need to watch, or we don't need to do ourselves. When we see somebody else put their hand on a hot burner and burn themselves, hopefully we learn that probably not a good idea for us to do that. And that's a helpful kind of response for us to have and learn going forward. Now, the pain matrix is kind of a controversial topic to some extent in neuroscience, because we once thought that this was the fingerprint that we were going to be able to identify who had pain and who didn't have pain. We were going to be able to look at fMRI blob scans and determine who's got real pain, who's got fake pain. And we'll talk how that just really hasn't come to that point, and we've really realized that it is not that way as far as how this works when it comes to it. But really it's thought to be what areas of the brain are commonly active when somebody's experiencing pain. And what that has been thought to be now is a salience detection network, as far as inputs that I need to pay attention and be mindful and protective, or that are important to put my consciousness on. And ideally dangerous stimuli are that. So what will happen is when these stimuli come in, there's different areas: the premotor cortex, the cingulate cortex, which talks about concentration and focusing, prefrontal cortex, problem solving and memory. The amygdala is a big one that we really think about, because when we start talking about fear and fear avoidance, the amygdala is what really is kind of the fear center, I guess, of our brain, that really wires in that emotional response into memory and in turn future behavior. So having an ability to modulate that amygdala through some exposure-based treatments and things, maybe we're targeting that amygdala and its connectivity into that person's brain activity around a pain experience. Sensory cortex, a lot of cerebellum with movement, hippocampus with memories, spinal cord. All these areas are active in a pain experience, and the more that these areas are active together through long-term potentiation, which is just this process within two cells communicating with each other, is the more they talk to each other, the stronger they will talk to each other, and the more wired together they are. So the thought with this is nerves that fire together, wire together, is what happens with our nervous system and how our nerves kind of fire together. And what happens with pain responses is the more environmental cues, beliefs, and different things that we talked about that are part of a pain experience and nociceptive information can kind of all conglomerate together to be what Butler and Moseley call a neurosignature of activity within your nervous system that kind of expresses itself in that emergent response of pain. So it's important to know these areas, and kind of important to know what's going on in the brain to best be able to treat and understand and help these people. One other kind of central nervous brain-driven response from a top-down perspective is conditioned pain modulation. So it's a stimulus into the nervous system that generates descending modulation. So, and it's often based on what the organism ascribes to that stimulus. Whether, in some of these tribal cultures, there's some treatments that look painful, that look abusive, that in that culture is ascribed to be healing. So they have the saliency of that stimulus to them is that represents healing, that represents me having pain relief. So that stimulus has more of maybe a dimmer effect on the information coming in from the tissues, where for somebody who doesn't live in that culture, that represents harm and danger, and gosh, that's if anything going to make my pain experience worse. And that's how culture effects can affect this. But we used to look at this as diffuse and noxious inhibitory control, which was basically noxious input into the nervous system is going to modulate that stimulus down a little bit, ideally, which when it's intact, which is basically if you bombard something with pain, your nervous system is going to shunt it down to decrease pain in that experience, to help you not experience a horrible experience. The way they teach that with folks is they basically will, they do these experiments where they'll have somebody have a thermode on their skin, and they put a input into the skin of a thermal noxious input, and have them measure their pain state, and then they will then have the patient dip their opposite leg in a cold noxious water bath, and for a designated period of time, and then they retest the arm thermode, same stimulus, and see if it's down modulated some of the pain levels that has happened. If somebody has conditioned pain modulation intact or descending analgesic mechanisms intact from their central nervous system, which can go awry with some patients, then that should show that the patient's pain reports after the cold noxious stimulus is less in that second thermal stimulus. So your nervous system, when exposed to that noxious cold water bath, brought down some nice top-down chemicals and inhibitory effects into the dorsal horn and spinal cord and tissues that made that pain experience less for the person experience it. And that's mainly how we've tested as a pain inhibits pain model, but it occurs with other stimuli, hypnosis, stress, distraction, different things that can cause our nervous system to down-modulate that pain experience. We also need to be aware of, maybe we know that now that we can't lengthen an IT band. We're not going to make it longer. That thing, not with the force that it takes, that we know histologically, we have no ability to lengthen that with man-made force. Maybe a car accident or a scalpel. But yet people love that treatment. Yet people feel that feels wonderful. They love rolling on it and causing pain. Maybe it's just noxious bombardment into that central nervous system that's causing descending modulation, where, after the fact, they do feel a little bit better after that. So now I can make sense of why, if somebody likes that treatment and wants to do it, not my cup of tea, but hey, as long as it's not maladaptive and they're not, that's not their only mode, and they have other ways to actively get self-efficacy of their condition, that maybe it's okay, and maybe I can explain that to them in a neuroscience-based way where I don't offend their belief in that intervention, yet they can still carry on with it. And again, provided there's not maladaptive in beliefs and it's pulling them away from gaining any other independent control of their symptoms. So we just have to understand that there's a lot of treatments. Painful treatments can unlock this. And I've really moved away from painful treatments just because I don't think they're often necessary. Rare occasions would I have patients going into painful treatments. Maybe some cases where there's some issues with soft tissue adaptations and different things, but not often am I going to have somebody do painful treatments. I just don't think there's any benefit of cranking somebody into pain if we can avoid it, because all we're going to do often is upregulate their pain state. So there's other modes to get descending modulation. Reassurance, positivity, hope, powerful things that can create a nice modulating effect from the central nervous system. Often those take those soft skills, which I agree with a lot of folks. Those are amazingly challenging skills to develop. I hate the fact that they're called soft skills, because communication, empathy, reassurance, all these things that really can generate a very powerful central nervous system response are hard to elicit out of people, especially when they live in a culture and a healthcare system that yanks it from them and robs it from them on a daily basis. So Gifford's book talks about, how do we move a nervous system from more gain pain on versus dimmer pain off, and there's some fluctuations that it can happen within the dorsal horn and brain and different things. I'm not going to read all these things, but these are just helpful things to think about when we're talking to people and hearing their story. What might be going on in their life that's moving them to a more sensitive agony state versus the total analgesic no pain state, and maybe we can try to move them towards more activities on that left side of this chart than the right side. And long-term potentiation, we touched upon it a little bit just a second ago, but that nerve on the left that looks like there's not a lot of neurotransmitters, there's not a lot of these areas of that carry the neurotransmitters within that terminal of the nerve on the top end, and there's not many receptors on the bottom end of that nerve, that when these nerves start communicating more and more, and this is often through a immune molecule that's partnered with a synapse that helps influence that neurotransmitter concentration and receptor concentration on these nerves that help them talk to each other more. So this is something that happens the more that these neural patterns fire together, the more that they wire together. And this happens with beliefs, knowledge, expectations, social context, other sensory cues, and also nociception. We can't disregard nociception to a full extent. That has to be considered and evaluated for, but not assumed, is the big key. Too often we assume there's a tissue at fault and don't consider the healing process and the big picture of a patient that might be driving the pain experience much more strongly than what might be going on in the tissue experience. Maybe we don't need to create 40 different systems in manuotherapy that are so minute and fine about making complexity have to be because we just aren't good enough with our hands. Maybe it's complexity because we're not understanding all the things in that nervous system that are influencing their pain experience. The one thing with other effects and other systems that are involved in this allostatic output or central nervous system top-down modulation through endocrine, immune, and nervous system is the reproductive system. I think sometimes we're seeing that these folks who have these persistent pain states, fibromyalgias, and homeostatic system dysfunctions don't have good reproductive function often. They can often have issues with that. But again, if you think of an organism that's in a state of survival, fight or flight, when you're in fight or flight mode, or as Adrian talks about the lions in the room, the lions jumped in the room with you, you don't think twice about reproducing. Your homeostatic systems don't prioritize strengthening the reproductive apparatus in your body. So, folks that are in more chronic stress, chronic, danger mode, their reproductive system has been really oftentimes dysregulated as well. So maybe helping them from a whole person perspective could help their reproductive status as well. Language, you'll often hear people with persistent pain say they just can't get words out of their mouth. They can't really communicate well. And there's discussions of how those areas in the pain matrix, when they get so busy processing pain, they don't do good at just basic executive function and cognitive function and language functions because they're so predominated with processing danger and other things that it considers more pressing at that time. Mood dysregulations, we frequently see folks that have had pain and it's resulted in depression, anxiety, all these other things that are often a part of our patient's story. Respiration's a big one. How many people do you see who are breathing so relaxed when they move? They're often at breath holding, tense. You can see it in their face with facial grimacing and pain behaviors. You can see all these things that often go. That's why breathing can be such a powerful treatment. And if you explain it from you need to bring them out of a fight or flight or their body living in a haunted house type behavior to more of a beach behavior or relaxation based behavior, it starts to make sense for people. So breathing treatments can be very powerful. But what other things do we hear with people? Gastrointestinal issues, IBS, a very common another system that's involved in a comorbid issue with these people, because the stress systems, if anybody's had like a very nervous situation where you had to go like do a big talk in front of a big group of people or different things where all of a sudden you're running to the bathroom 3 times because your GI system's all going bonkers with that stress on board. Well, imagine that's your system chronically, where you're getting this chronic disinhibition or chronic dysregulation of your GI system, which I think is more what IBS is all about from my reading. Sleep is another one that gets dysregulated. When your system's on line in the room, what reason does it have to go down to where it can downregulate to the point you can get some good sleep? So again, we need to kind of connect the dots with people. The end story with all this stuff is pain is a massively complex thing. I hope if anything you've gotten out of these lectures that we've talked about is that pain is not a simple linear input-output thing. It is modulated by an immense amount of complexity, multi-system inputs, a lot of different cognitive, psychological, social factors that come into it, and we still don't understand it completely. So science is going to be moving forward. I hope you move forward with it. We need to look beyond just the tissues. Start reading more than just PTJ and JOSPT, and I love my manual therapy journal. Not saying those are bad journals, but it really cordons your thinking and your thought process off to one way of looking at a patient. We have to listen to our patients. All these stressors and things and different things are part of our patient's story. Our unique story, or the unique story of the patient that comes with us, influences their biology. It influences how stress system behaviors are act. So it makes sense, instead of just interrogating their tissues and listening for what their tissues are telling you, why don't you listen to the human being that's in front of you and listen for what their life and how their identity's been compromised because of the pain state, how their life's been impacted because of this pain state, how their psychology and social lives are greatly impacting their condition. You might just understand and be able to piece the dots together to a patient who's been traveling a medical merry-go-round for 30 to 40 years, and you're the first person to connect these dots and give them hope. I hope you'll consider that. And recognize that if you're a manual therapist who's been trained like me, I've been in through fellowship training, that I still have the bias sometimes to look through the tissues too much. But sometimes you got to be careful that you don't ignore the tissues. So it's all a balance. We can't just get too cordoned off into one way of thinking. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. Let's go forward. Let's change this pain game.